The bank smelled like fresh coffee and cold air conditioning. Monday morning, 9 o'clock sharp. Daniel Carter sat across from the branch manager, a young man named Peter Hollis, who kept glancing at the folder between them like it might bite him. On the desk, 6 bank cards fanned out like a losing hand of poker. A leather checkbook corners worn soft from 40 years of use. A trust folder thick as a Bible, and one handwritten note sealed in a plain white envelope. Peter cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, if we complete this, every account your son can access will be frozen within minutes." Daniel nodded once. His hands rested flat on the desk still. "That's exactly why I'm here." Peter hesitated, the cursor blinking on his monitor. "Your son is listed on all of them. As a signer, sometimes as a beneficiary." "No." Daniel's voice didn't rise. It never did. He was only allowed to use them. Outside the window, a delivery truck idled at the curb. A woman walked her dog past the glass doors. Ordinary Monday. Ordinary world going on about its business, while Daniel Carter's whole life quietly rearranged itself on a computer screen 3 feet away. Peter looked at him one more time the way people look at someone right before they do something that can't be undone. Daniel gave him nothing to work with. No anger in his face, no grief either. Just the patience of a man who had already made peace with a decision days ago and was only now watching it arrive. "Are you certain?" Peter asked. "I've never been more certain of anything in 66 years. Peter pressed enter. Somewhere across town, in a house with a 3-car garage and a lawn serviced every Thursday, numbers began disappearing. A brokerage balance, a joint checking account, a line of credit tied to a boat Jason had bought 18 months ago, and never once asked his father to help pay off because he never had to. It had simply always been there, like electricity, like water from a tap, like a father who never says no. Millions of dollars gone from his son's reach in under 4 seconds. Daniel slid the small white envelope across the desk. "Mail this to him tomorrow." "Not today. Tomorrow." "Yes, sir." Daniel stood, buttoned his jacket, an old brown corduroy blazer he'd owned since Jacqueline, his late wife, was still alive to iron the collar for him. He didn't look back at the folder or the cards or the 8-digit number that had just vanished from a boy who used to fall asleep on his shoulder during Sunday drives. He walked out into the Ohio morning sun. No slammed door, no raised voice, no triumphant smile, just an old man in a corduroy jacket walking toward his truck like he had somewhere quiet to be. 24 hours earlier, at a dinner table 40 minutes away, his son had told him to stop wasting his money. Jason had no idea the 2 hours after that dinner would be the last 2 hours he'd ever spend as a rich man. 3 years before that morning at the bank, Daniel Carter buried his wife on a Tuesday in October under a maple tree just starting to turn. He went back to work the following Monday. Not because grief didn't touch him, because Jacqueline had asked him once, years earlier, half joking, half not, "Promise me you won't just sit in a chair and wait to die when I go." He'd promised. He kept his promises. Even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones. So he built a life out of small, steady things. 6 a.m. every morning. Coffee black in the mug Jacqueline had bought him at a county fair in 1994. The handle chipped now, but still holding. He drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the light come up slow over the back fence. Then the ledger, a real one-paper columns in his own handwriting because he didn't trust apps to tell him the truth about his own money the way ink did. Then the garden. Tomatoes mostly. Peppers. A row of beans that climbed a trellis he'd built from scrap lumber the summer Jacqueline got sick, needing somewhere to put his hands while his mind sat somewhere else entirely. By 8, he was usually next door on his knees in Harold Pemberton's driveway, replacing a serpentine belt Harold's grandson couldn't figure out from YouTube. Daniel never took money for it. Sometimes a jar of tomato preserves came back the other way. That felt fair to him. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Daniel Carter as the quiet one. Reliable, unshowy. The man who fixed your porch step before you'd even mentioned it was Luce, who noticed things. A flickering street lamp, a lonely kid 2 doors down, a widow whose grass had gone too long without cutting. They also believed, without much evidence beyond appearances, that Daniel Carter didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. It wasn't hard to see why. He drove a 2009 Ford pickup with a dent in the tailgate he'd never bothered fixing. His house was a modest three-bedroom ranch he and Jacqueline had bought in 1988 and never upgraded because they'd never needed to. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts and rotation work boots, resoled twice rather than replaced. When the church took up a collection for a family who'd lost their home to a fire, Daniel gave quietly folded bills tucked into an envelope with no name on it, and let people assume he'd given what little he could spare. Nobody asked why a retired man who'd spent 35 years building a financial planning firm from a single rented office into one of the most respected private wealth practices in the state chose to live like this. Nobody asked because nobody thought to. Daniel had built his reputation the same quiet way he built everything else, brick by brick, decade by decade, and then deliberately let it disappear from view the day he retired. Wealth that announces itself invites the wrong kind of attention, he used to tell young associates. Wealth that stays quiet keeps its friends honest. His son Jason had never quite absorbed that lesson. Jason Carter, 39, lived 20 minutes away in a 5-bedroom colonial with a 3-car garage, a lawn service, and a wife, Melanie, who redecorated the living room every couple of years, the way other people repainted a fence. He drove a Range Rover that cost more than Daniel's house had 30 years ago and today combined. He belonged to Fairview Country Club, where he played golf on Saturdays with men who assumed correctly that Jason came from money and assumed incorrectly that the money was his. Jason had a habit at the club of saying it with a laugh that made it sound like affection instead of what it actually was. "Dad couldn't survive without me, honestly. Somebody's got to keep an eye on the old man." The men around the table would chuckle. Order another round. Nobody in that clubhouse had ever seen Daniel Carter's tax returns or the trust documents drawn up 2 decades earlier by a lawyer named Arthur Feldman, or the quiet 7-figure line item that had covered without a single conversation about it. Jason's college tuition, his first business failure, the down payment on the Colonial, half the wedding to Melanie, and 3 separate times over the last 6 years, a bridge loan from Daniel's investment account that nobody called a bridge loan out loud because that would have required Jason to acknowledge it was a loan at all. His 14-year-old daughter Ellie sometimes asked why Grandpa Dan drove such an old truck. "Grandpa's set in his ways," Jason would say, reaching for his phone. "He's fine. He likes it simple." He believed that. That was the strange part. Jason wasn't lying, not exactly. He'd simply never once turned the question around and asked what simple was quietly subsidizing. Daniel noticed things Jason didn't know to look for. He noticed how Melanie's new patio furniture arrived the same month he'd covered Ellie's orthodontist bill without being asked. He noticed how Jason's business, a marketing consultancy that had restructured twice in 5 years, never seemed to generate profit, only expenses, and how those expenses always seemed to find their way, eventually gently, into a conversation that started with, "Hey Dad, quick favor." He never said any of it out loud. He wasn't building a case. Not yet. He was simply a man who paid attention to the garden, to the neighbors, to the slow accumulation of small truths that people revealed about themselves through their choices, whether they meant to or not. That autumn, his eyesight had started going soft at the edges. Reading the ledger took longer. The doctor used a word Daniel didn't love, progressive, and mentioned a surgery and a number, $18,000. Daniel wasn't worried about the money. He had never once in 3 years of quiet, modest living been worried about the money. He was, for reasons he couldn't yet name, worried about his son's face when he mentioned it. Sunday dinner at Jason's house had been a standing ritual for 6 years, ever since Melanie decided that family needed structure, and structure meant a leg of lamb or a brisket every week at 6 o'clock, whether anyone particularly wanted to be there or not. Daniel arrived at 5:45, as he always did, a jar of his own tomato preserves in one hand and a small gift for Ellie in the other. This week, a paperback of a novel she'd mentioned wanting. He noticed walking up the driveway a new pergola over the back patio. Cedar, expensive, still smelling faintly of sawdust. He didn't ask about it. He'd learned not to ask about things like that. Asking only ever led to an explanation that cost him money he hadn't planned on spending. Ellie hugged him at the door, taller than she'd been at Easter. "Grandpa Dan, I finished the book you got me last time. Can we talk about the ending?" "After dinner," Daniel said, and meant it, and she believed him because he always did. Dinner started ordinary enough. Melanie talked about a friend's kitchen renovation. Ellie mentioned a school trip to Washington that cost $400, and Jason said without looking up from his plate, "Put it on my card. I'll handle it," in the easy tone of a man for whom $400 had never once required a second thought. Daniel waited until the plates were half cleared before he brought it up. He'd rehearsed it briefly in the truck on the drive over, not out of nervousness, but out of habit, the same care he brought to everything. State the fact. Don't dress it up. Don't make it smaller than it was, and don't make it bigger. "I'm having some trouble with my eyes," he said. "Doctor recommends surgery. I'll be using some of the money from the investment account to cover it." He said the investment account the way he always had the language he and Jason had used for years, a shorthand for a fund neither of them had ever precisely defined out loud, though Daniel had always understood exactly what it was, his money patiently grown quietly available. Jason's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "How much?" 18,000. The fork went down, not slammed. Set down carefully the way a man sets down something he's about to pick back up as a weapon. "Are you serious right now?" Daniel looked at his son. Something in his chest tightened small and familiar, the way it always did a half second before he understood a conversation had already gone somewhere he hadn't chosen to go. He noticed it. He didn't chase it. "Jason," Melanie's voice quiet, a warning that wasn't quite a warning. "No, I'm asking a real question." Jason's jaw worked. "Dad, can you please for once stop wasting my money?" The table went still. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow. Ellie's fork froze against her plate. Melanie's eyes dropped to the tablecloth and stayed there and did not come back up. "You already lived your life," Jason said, and his voice had found its rhythm now the way it did when he decided he was right and simply needed the room to catch up to him. $18,000 for eye surgery you could probably put off or get done cheaper somewhere else, or, I don't know, Dad, I have a family. Ellie's got the DC trip. Melanie wants to redo the guest bathroom. We've got the Fairview dues coming up. That money belongs to my family now. It's not just sitting there for you to spend whenever something comes up." Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at the candle in the center of the table, half-melted wax pooling unevenly around the wick. He looked at Ellie's hands still holding her fork knuckles pale. He noticed his own hands resting flat on the table, exactly the way they had rested on the desk at the bank 3 years later, though of course he didn't know that, yet couldn't know it. Only felt something in his body settle into a stillness that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with the particular quiet that comes right before a man understands something he cannot unknow. Nobody said anything in his defense. Not Melanie, who had redecorated 3 rooms in the last 2 years, off money that had come one way or another from the same account Jason had just called my family's. Not Ellie, 14 too young to be asked to referee her father, though Daniel would never once blame her for the silence, not for a single day of the rest of his life. The room simply let it stand. Let his settle over the table like dust. Daniel put down his fork. "I'm sorry," he said, quiet, even. "I didn't mean to ruin dinner." "Dad, that's not—" Melanie started too late, the words arriving after the moment they might have mattered. "It's all right." Daniel stood, folded his napkin a small, precise motion, and set it beside his plate. "Ellie, we'll talk about that ending next time, I promise." Ellie's eyes were wet. She nodded, didn't trust her voice. Jason stayed seated. Didn't get up. Didn't walk him to the door. Just sat there with his jaw still tight, the particular expression of a man who believes with total sincerity that he has said something reasonable, and everyone else in the room is simply being too sensitive about it. Daniel let himself out. The drive home took 18 minutes. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't grip the wheel any tighter than usual. Somewhere around the 3rd stoplight, a thought arrived, plain and unhurried, the way most true things arrive for him. Not as an explosion, but as a fact settling quietly into place beside all the other facts he'd been collecting for years without naming them. He doesn't think it's my money. He thinks it's his money that I'm still allowed for now to borrow from. He pulled into his own driveway a few minutes later, sat in the truck a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, hands still on the wheel. No anger came. He waited for it, almost curious, the way you might wait to see if a bruise hurts when you press it. It didn't come. What came instead was quieter and heavier, and would not leave him alone for the rest of that night or the next morning or for a long time after that. Not a single argument had happened at that table. The silence had said everything the shouting never needed to. He didn't cry that night. He hadn't cried in 3 years, not since the morning after the funeral, when he woke reaching for a shoulder that wasn't there and caught himself before the sound could leave his throat. Grief had taught him where the pause lived. He'd learned to find it again whenever something threatened to knock him sideways. Instead, he made tea. Chamomile, the kind Jacqueline used to keep in a tin shaped like a rooster, still in the same cupboard, still in the same place, because moving it would have felt like erasing something. He carried the mug to the small back room that used to be Jacqueline's sewing room, and was now mostly his study, a roll-top desk, a reading chair with a cracked leather armrest, a shelf of paperbacks. Neither of them had ever gotten around to reading twice. On the second shelf, behind a stack of old seed catalogs, sat a leather notebook, its cover soft and dark, with age a rubber band holding it closed, because the clasp had broken sometime in the Clinton administration. Jacqueline had given it to him the year he opened his first office, a converted storefront, on Route 9, 400 square feet, a card table for a desk. Every man needs somewhere to put the truth when it's too heavy to carry in his head. She'd said, only half joking, the way she said most of her wisest things. He'd written in it on and off for 38 years. He untied the rubber band and opened to a page near the middle, ink faded to sepia, his own handwriting, younger and sharper than it was now. Never confuse access with ownership. He'd written that the year he turned 40 after a client, a good man, a decent man, had signed his adult son onto every account, just in case, and watched 3 years later in Daniel's own office as that same son quietly drained an inheritance meant to last a widow 20 years. Daniel remembered the client's face, remembered thinking at the time, I will never let that happen to anyone I love, because I understand the difference between generosity and surrender. He'd built his entire career on that sentence, and somewhere in the last decade, tending his garden and fixing his neighbors' cars, he'd let himself half forget he'd built his own family's finances on it too. He sat in the reading chair a long time, tea going lukewarm in his hands, and let the memory come the rest of the way. 35 years building Carter Wealth Advisory from that card table into one of the most trusted private planning firms in the state. He'd counseled hundreds of families through exactly the situation he now recognized uncomfortably as his own well-meaning parents who confused helping with handing over, who let a signature on a joint account slowly calcify in everyone's mind, but the parents into an inheritance already spent. He had not made that mistake. Not on paper. Whatever else had drifted, whatever quiet erosion had happened around the dinner table, in the tone of his son's voice, in the unspoken assumption that had settled over his family like fog, the structure itself had never bent. Before he'd retired 11 years ago, Arthur Feldman, the same attorney who'd drawn up his very first client trust, back when they were both young enough to still believe paperwork was interesting, had helped him fold nearly everything that mattered into a network of trusts and holding entities. The house, the investment portfolio, what remained of the firm's sale proceeds. Even the truck technically sat in a small holding LLC, though Daniel had never once mentioned that to anyone, because it had never once seemed relevant. Jason had been added to several of the accounts. Not as an owner, never as an owner. As an authorized signer so he could help if Daniel were ever hospitalized. As an emergency contact so a bank could reach him if something happened. As a contingent beneficiary on 2 accounts, meaning someday if I die and if certain conditions are met. Daniel remembered signing those documents, remembered feeling at the time something like relief. My son is responsible enough that I can trust him with access, and a smaller, quieter hope tucked inside that relief. The hope every parent carries without quite admitting it. Maybe this will mean something to him. Maybe being trusted will make him trustworthy. He set the mug down on the side table, careful, precise, the same small precision he'd carried out of his son's dining room an hour earlier. He understood something now sitting alone in his dead wife's sewing room, with a notebook open on his lap, that he hadn't fully let himself understand at that table. He hadn't raised a criminal. Jason had never taken a dollar that wasn't technically offered. That was the strange, sad shape of it. Jason had simply spent 39 years absorbing a lesson nobody meant to teach him, that his father's yes was a permanent condition of the universe, like weather, like gravity, something that simply existed around him and required no particular gratitude, because gratitude implies the possibility of a no. He had raised someone who'd confused generosity with inheritance. Daniel sat with that a while. Let it be true without rushing to fix it. He had learned over 66 years that understanding a wound and treating a wound were two entirely different acts, and that doing the second before finishing the first almost always made things worse. He went to bed a little after 11, slept if not well at least without dreams he remembered. In the morning, he made his coffee, drank it at the window, as always watched the light come up over the fence. Then instead of the garden, he drove into town. Arthur Feldman's office hadn't changed much in 20 years. Same brass nameplate, same wood-paneled reception room, same secretary Doris who'd been answering his phone since Daniel's hair was still mostly brown. Arthur was 71 now, silver-haired, still sharp as a new blade. He waved Daniel into the inner office without an appointment, the privilege of 40 years of friendship. Daniel Carter, to what do I owe? He stopped reading something in Daniel's face that Daniel himself hadn't consciously offered. Sit down. What happened? Daniel told him. Plainly. No embellishment, no editorializing, just the facts of a Sunday dinner laid out the way he'd have laid out a client's balance sheet. Arthur listened without interrupting the way good lawyers and good friends both learn to do, and when Daniel finished, he pulled a thick folder from a locked file cabinet behind his desk. A folder Daniel recognized, though he hadn't seen it opened in over a decade. Arthur put on his reading glasses, turned a few pages, set the folder down between them. You want the honest answer or the gentle one? I've never once asked you for the gentle one, Arthur. Arthur almost smiled. Legally, he said, your son owns nothing. Not the investment account, not the trust. Not 1 square foot of the house he thinks you're rattling around alone in. He has access signing privileges on 2 accounts, contingent beneficiary status on 2 more, all of which you granted, and all of which you can revoke entirely with my signature and yours inside of a week. And the country club dues, the pergola, the Range Rover payments. Arthur's eyebrows rose slightly. He hadn't heard about the pergola. None of that, Arthur said, was ever anyone's but yours, Daniel. He's been living inside your generosity for so long, he's forgotten it has walls. Daniel looked out the window at the parking lot at an ordinary Tuesday going on about its business. He didn't feel angry. He noted that, almost with curiosity, the way he'd learned to note most things about himself over the years, a kind of gentle inventory taken without judgment. What he felt instead was clearer than anger, quieter, a settling the way sediment settles once you stop stirring the water. I'm not looking for revenge, Arthur. I know you're not. You've never once in 40 years asked me for revenge on anyone. Arthur closed the folder. But I think you're looking for the truth to finally match the paperwork. And Daniel, the paperwork's been on your side the whole time. You just never needed to use it before. Daniel nodded slowly. Draw up whatever changes I'll need, he said. Take your time doing it right. I'm not in a hurry. He meant that too. Whatever was coming, he intended to walk toward it the same way he walked toward everything, without running, without shouting, and without a single backward glance he hadn't chosen to take. Arthur's office called it restructuring. Daniel thought of it privately as something closer to tending a garden pulling weeds that had grown so close to the vegetables you almost stopped seeing them as separate plants. It took 6 weeks. Nothing about it looked dramatic from the outside. Daniel still drank his coffee at the window every morning at 6. Still knelt in Harold Pemberton's driveway when something needed fixing. Still walked the rows of his garden most evenings, checking the tomatoes, listening to the cicadas start up as the light went gold and then gray. But 2 mornings a week instead of the garden, he drove into town. He sat across from Arthur and a young associate named Priya Nair, who had a gift for making complicated paperwork sound like weather, simple, unremarkable, the kind of thing you mentioned in passing, and then got on with your day. Together they moved through the folder page by page. The joint signing authority on the primary investment account came first. Daniel had held it jointly with Jason for 11 years. It took Priya 4 minutes to draft the revocation and 1 signature to make it real. The beneficiary designations on 2 accounts changed, next not removed entirely. Daniel was careful about that he had no interest in cutting his son out of a life that would eventually someday naturally pass to him. He simply changed the language from immediate to contingent upon terms to be reviewed, which meant in practice that whatever Jason eventually inherited would arrive on Daniel's terms at Daniel's timing, structured the way Daniel had always structured things for clients who needed protecting from themselves. The joint banking privileges at the credit union closed a 15-minute conversation with a manager Daniel had known for a decade who didn't ask questions beyond the ones required by law. The brokerage access came next, then the property access, a spare key, and an old power of attorney Jason had never once used, but had apparently mentioned to friends at Fairview as evidence that Daniel trusted him with everything. Medical directives updated. The old paperwork had named Jason as Daniel's healthcare proxy in an emergency. The new paperwork named Daniel's sister Ruth in Cincinnati, a retired nurse who called every Sunday and had never once in 66 years asked Daniel for anything at all. And finally, the estate plan itself, not gutted, not vindictive, but rewritten with the same careful hand Daniel had once used on hundreds of other families' futures. Assets moved fully into the trust structure Arthur had built decades earlier. A vesting schedule replaced a lump sum. A letter of intent sealed explaining Daniel's reasoning to whoever might need to understand it someday, Ellie most likely when she was old enough. Jason noticed none of it. That was the part that would have surprised most people, and didn't surprise Daniel at all because he understood better than almost anyone that a man who has never once checked the terms of his own good fortune rarely thinks to start checking now. Jason kept spending. A new set of golf clubs mid-August, the kind that cost more than Daniel's truck had new in 2009. A long weekend in Napa with Melanie paid for on a card Daniel no longer had any obligation toward, though the statement when it eventually surfaced would tell its own quiet story. At Fairview over drinks after a Saturday round, Jason told his usual table of friends, with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he's just won an argument he was never actually in. Had a little talk with my old man. I think he finally understands who's in charge around here. He meant it as a joke. He believed with the same total sincerity he'd brought to the dinner table weeks earlier that the Sunday night blow-up had settled something in his favor, that Daniel's silence at the door had been the silence of a man who'd been put properly in his place. He had no idea it had been the silence of a man walking toward a decision he'd already made 3 years earlier, the night he buried his wife and promised her, without saying it out loud, that he would never again let anyone mistake his generosity for weakness. In early September, Daniel drove 4 hours north to a small town on the edge of a lake he'd visited once decades ago, with Jacqueline, back when they were young enough to think a weekend away was an extravagance worth saving for months to afford. He found a cottage for rent, modest one-bedroom, a dock that needed 2 new boards, and a coat of stain, a view of water that turned the color of the sky twice a day at dawn and at dusk. He signed a 6-month lease under his own name, paid the deposit from an account with no one else's name attached to it, and told no one. Not Ruth, not Harold Pemberton next door, who assumed when Daniel mentioned he'd be traveling some that he meant a fishing trip. He didn't know yet exactly when he'd need it. He only knew the way he'd known most important things in his life, quietly and early, well before he had proof that he would need somewhere to go that had nothing waiting for him there. No expectations, no dinner table. No one who believed his money belonged to them before he'd offered it. On the drive home, he stopped at a diner off the interstate, ordered coffee and a slice of pie. He didn't finish and sat for a while by the window watching trucks pull in and out of the lot. He thought about Ellie mostly, about the wet shine in her eyes at that dinner table, the way she'd looked at her father and then quickly looked away, the particular loneliness of a 14-year-old who has just learned that the adults at her table will let silence do the work that courage should have done instead. He thought, too, about the sentence in Jacqueline's handwriting on the final page of the notebook, one he hadn't reread in years, but could recite from memory anyway. The greatest inheritance isn't wealth. It's becoming someone worthy of receiving it. He wondered whether Jason could still become that. He didn't know. He found sitting in that diner with his coffee going cold that he could hold both things at once without either canceling the other, out love for his son, in the clear, settled knowledge that love was no longer going to look like a blank check. He drove the rest of the way home in silence, no radio windows cracked to let the last of the summer air in. The garden needed watering when he got back. He did that first before anything else, kneeling in the dirt in his work clothes, feeling the cool give of the soil under his palms, the particular relief of a task with a beginning and an end, and no ambiguity about what it required of him. Somewhere behind him, 40 minutes away, his son was telling a new set of friends the same joke about who was finally in charge. Daniel didn't know exactly when the moment would come. He only knew watering the last row of tomatoes as the light went down gold over the fence that it was closer now than it had been that morning, and that when it arrived he would not need to raise his voice to make it unmistakable. The dinner invitation came from Melanie on a Thursday in late September over text. Jason wants to do something nice hosting Saturday, just family 6 o'clock. He's been in a good mood, thought it'd be a good time to all be together. Daniel read it twice standing at his kitchen window with his coffee going cold in his hand, and felt something in his chest that wasn't quite hope, but wasn't far from it either. The small, stubborn hope that never fully leaves a parent no matter how much evidence has accumulated against it. Maybe something's shifted. Maybe he's thought about that Sunday since. He drove over Saturday evening with a jar of preserves and a book for Ellie, same as always. The house looked different from the last time he'd visited. New landscape lighting along the front walk, soft gold pools spilling across a lawn that had itself recently been resodded. In the driveway beside the Range Rover sat a boat on a trailer Daniel hadn't seen before, a new one, sleek, the price tag practically still hanging off it. Jason met him at the door with a wide smile and a handshake that turned into a half-hug, the kind of warmth Daniel hadn't felt from his son in months. "Dad, glad you could make it." Dinner was good. Genuinely good. Melanie had made a rib roast. Ellie talked animatedly about a school project on the Great Lakes, and for the first 40 minutes Daniel let himself believe that maybe this once the evening would end the way it started. It didn't survive dessert. Jason brought it up himself unprompted over coffee, not with anger this time, but with the breezy confidence of a man circling back to unfinished business he considered already settled. "Speaking of expenses," he said, cutting into a slice of pie, "I saw the statement from your eye thing finally cleared. 18 grand, right?" He shook his head, a small laugh in his throat. "Dad, honestly, stop wasting my money on stuff like that. You've got Medicare, there's cheaper options, you didn't even ask me first." Melanie's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Ellie's eyes dropped to her plate, the same reflex from 6 weeks earlier, already learned, already automatic. Daniel set his own fork down gently, the way he always did. He noticed the tightening in his chest, familiar now, almost welcome, a signal he'd learned to recognize rather than obey. He let it pass through him without reaching for it. He noticed Jason's laugh, easy and unbothered, a man completely unaware he was standing at the edge of something. "I appreciate your concern," Daniel said, even, unhurried. "I'm serious, though." Jason leaned back, pleased with himself, warming to the subject the way he always did once he believed he had an audience. "You've got to let us handle more of this stuff going forward. You're not exactly," he gestured vaguely, searching for a word gentle enough to say in front of Ellie, "you're not getting younger, Dad. Best to just let me manage things." Daniel looked at his son for a long moment. Not with anger, with something closer to recognition, the particular clarity of watching a stranger say something you'd expected to hear from him for months, and finding when it finally arrived that it didn't hurt the way you thought it would. It simply confirmed something you already knew. "You're right," Daniel said quietly. "It's time things got managed properly." Jason grinned, mistaking agreement for surrender. "Good. Glad we're on the same page." Daniel stayed another 20 minutes, complimented the pie, asked Ellie about her project, listened with his full attention, the way he always did, told her he'd bring her a book about the Great Lakes next time he found one. He hugged Melanie goodbye. He shook his son's hand at the door, the same warm handshake from the start of the evening, and meant something entirely different by it now than Jason understood. He drove home in silence. At his own kitchen table, he opened his phone and made one call, not to Arthur, whose part was already finished, papers signed and filed weeks earlier, but to Priya, who picked up on the second ring as though she'd been waiting. "It's time," Daniel said. "I can have everything ready at First Merchants first thing Monday." "No." Daniel looked at the clock above his stove. 7:40. "Tonight, tomorrow morning at the latest. I don't want to sit with this any longer than I have to." There was a brief pause on the line, not hesitation, just recalculation. "I can meet you at the branch at 9 tomorrow. Peter Hollis is expecting the paperwork already. We prepared it in advance in case you wanted to move quickly." 9, Daniel said. "I'll be there." He hung up and sat at his kitchen table a while, the house quiet around him, Jacqueline's rooster tin visible on the counter in the dim evening light. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel vindicated. What he felt mostly was the particular stillness that comes at the end of a long, patient decision. The same stillness he imagined a surgeon might feel the night before a scheduled operation. Not eager, not afraid, simply ready, because the planning had already done the hard work months ago. He wrote the letter that night at his roll-top desk in the same leather notebook Jacqueline had given him 38 years earlier. He wrote it 3 times before he was satisfied, not because the words were difficult to find, but because he wanted badly to leave exactly the right amount and nothing more. No cruelty, no lecture. Just the truth stated as plainly as he'd have stated it to any client who'd made the same mistake his son had made. He copied the final version onto a single sheet of plain paper, folded it once, and sealed it in a white envelope. The next morning he woke at 6, same as always. Made his coffee, drank it at the window watching the light come up over the fence. He didn't rush the ritual even knowing what waited 2 hours away. Especially knowing. He arrived at the bank at 8:50, 10 minutes early, and sat in his truck across the lot for a moment, hands steady on the wheel, watching an ordinary Monday go on about its business around him, a woman walking her dog, a delivery truck idling at the curb. Inside, Peter Hollis was waiting with the folder already prepared Priya beside him for support, though her part was mostly finished. 6 cards fanned across the desk. The checkbook. The trust folder, thick as a Bible. "Mr. Carter," Peter said, "if we complete this, every account your son can access will be frozen within minutes. That's exactly why I'm here." The rest happened exactly the way it had happened 3 hours earlier in a moment that hadn't occurred yet from where the story now stood, except, of course, it wasn't the future anymore. It was simply now. Peter's cursor blinked. Daniel's hand stayed flat and still on the desk, and when the moment came when Peter finally asked one last time whether Daniel was certain, "I've never been more certain of anything in 66 years." Daniel Carter watched millions of dollars quietly leave his son's reach, slid a sealed white envelope across the desk with instructions to mail it tomorrow, and walked out into the Ohio sun without raising his voice, without looking back, and without a single flicker of doubt. He drove straight home, packed one suitcase already half prepared in his closet, locked the front door behind him, and turned his phone off before he reached the end of his own driveway. By the time Jason tried to call him that evening, the number was already disconnected. The first sign came at 7:14 the next morning in the drive-through line at a coffee shop off Route 9. Jason's card declined. He tried it twice, laughed it off to the barista as a bank glitch paid cash from his wallet, and thought nothing more of it until he pulled into the office parking lot and his phone buzzed with a mortgage notification he'd never seen before. Payment failed. Insufficient funds available in linked account. He sat in the Range Rover a full minute staring at the screen, telling himself it was some kind of processing error. He'd never once in 6 years in that house seen that notification. He didn't fully know what it meant procedurally, only that it meant something, the particular unease of a man discovering a language he'd never had to learn. By 9, the unease had a name. The brokerage app wouldn't load his account at all, a login error then, when he called the support line, a representative telling him with the careful neutrality of someone reading from a script that his access credentials had been removed by the account holder 3 weeks earlier. Removed by who? The primary account holder, sir, Daniel Carter. Jason laughed. Actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound, the laugh of a man certain there's been some clerical mistake that a phone call will fix. That account's mine too. I've had signing authority on that for years. I'm showing that authorization was revoked on September the 2nd, sir. He hung up without saying goodbye. By 11, his business loan officer had left a voicemail, the line of credit Jason had used to keep his consultancy afloat through its second restructuring had apparently been guaranteed in part by an asset Jason had never once thought to ask about, an asset now unavailable as collateral. The loan was being called. By noon, Fairview Country Club's membership office called Melanie directly, since the dues payment, automatically drafted for 11 years, from an account that had until 3 weeks ago listed Jason as a joint signer, had bounced, and the club, with the particular tact of an institution accustomed to discretion, was asking whether the family wished to update their payment information or discuss a pause in membership status. By 1, the boat dealership called about the trailer payment. By 2, Jason was sitting in his own driveway in the Range Rover engine off air conditioning, dying with its sweat gathering at his collar, staring at his phone, and dialing his father's number for the 9th time. This number is no longer in service. He called Ruth in Cincinnati, next Daniel's sister, whom Jason had met maybe a dozen times in his life, mostly at holidays, and who answered on the 3rd ring with a wariness Jason didn't recognize as deliberate. "Aunt Ruth." "Hey, it's Jason. Have you heard from Dad? I can't reach him, and there's some bank stuff going on. I think there's been a mistake with his accounts. I haven't heard from your father since Sunday." Ruth said which was true, and volunteered nothing further, which was also quietly a choice. By 4, Jason had called 2 lawyers. Both gave him in slightly different words the same answer Peter Hollis had already given him informally over the phone that morning, before compliance made him stop taking Jason's calls, and all the accounts in question belonged entirely and unambiguously to trusts and holding entities controlled solely by Daniel Carter. Jason's name appeared nowhere on a deed, nowhere on a title, nowhere as anything but an authorized signer whose authorization had been formally, legally, irreversibly revoked. "There's nothing here that says the money was ever yours," one lawyer told him not unkindly. "There's a lot here that says your father let you use it." By 6, an accountant Melanie had frantically called, said much the same thing in the gentler language accountants use when delivering news they know will not be received gently. Jason sat at his own kitchen table that evening, the same table where weeks earlier he'd told his father to stop wasting his money, and stared at the wall. Melanie hadn't said much all day. She sat across from him now, arms crossed, not comforting, not accusing, simply watching her husband absorb something she herself hadn't yet found words for. Ellie came downstairs around 7 quiet, and found the letter first, the white envelope forwarded by Peter Hollis exactly as instructed, sitting unopened on the front hall table where the mail always landed. She brought it to her father without a word. Jason turned it over in his hands, recognized his father's handwriting on the front. Jason, nothing else. No last name, the same handwriting that had signed birthday cards and school permission slips, and once a college tuition check that had arrived. Jason now understood for the first time from an account he had never once thought to ask his father about. He opened it. One sheet, one sentence centered on the page in Daniel's careful hand. "You spent years believing permission meant ownership. Nothing else. No signature, no explanation, no forwarding address." Jason read it 4 times, then 5. He set it down on the table, and for a long moment, nobody in the kitchen said anything at all. Melanie watching him, Ellie standing in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself, the refrigerator humming in the silence, the way it always had, indifferent to what had just been said in the room it sat in. Jason didn't shout. That surprised even him later, thinking back on it. The version of himself he'd have predicted a week earlier would have thrown the letter across the room, would have called every number he had for his father until the phone company itself intervened. Instead, he simply sat there, the paper trembling faintly in his hand, and felt something crack open that had nothing to do with the money at all, though it would take him weeks longer to understand exactly what. "Dad's gone," he said finally, to no one, to the room, to himself. He's gone." Ellie's voice small from the doorway. "Where?" Jason looked up at his daughter's face, the same face that had looked away from him at that dinner table weeks ago, learning without anyone meaning to teach her the particular lesson of watching an adult be right and having no one at the table brave enough to say so out loud. "I don't know," Jason said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he meant the words with his whole chest, no performance in them at all. "I don't know where my father is." Outside, the sun was going down over a lawn that had been resodded 3 weeks earlier, with money that it turned out had never once actually belonged to him. It took Jason 3 weeks to find him. Not because Daniel had hidden well, he'd never once in his whole life been a man who cared about being hard to find. He simply hadn't told anyone where he'd gone, and nobody had thought until now to ask. It was Ruth finally who gave it up, not out of cruelty toward her nephew, but because she'd watched him unravel over 3 phone calls, each one a little more desperate than the last, and decided a son deserved the chance to make things right, even if he didn't yet deserve to be forgiven. "There's a lake," she told him. "Northern part of the state. That's all I'll say. Your father will tell you the rest if he wants to." Jason drove up on a Saturday in October, 4 hours north, the leaves just starting to turn the way they had the week they'd buried his mother, though he didn't make that connection until much later. The cottage was smaller than anything Jason had expected. One-story cedar shingled a dock out front, with two new boards still lighter than the rest, not yet weathered to match. A canoe rested upside down on sawhorses beside the porch. Smoke rose thin and steady from a chimney. Jason parked at the end of the gravel drive and sat in the car a long moment, the way his father had once sat in a truck outside a photography studio, though Jason didn't know that story and never would. He'd rehearsed something on the drive up, an apology, a defense, some combination of both, and found walking toward the porch that every version of it had evaporated somewhere around the second new board on the dock. Daniel was on the porch in an old flannel shirt Jason recognized from a decade of holidays, mending a fishing net across his knees, a task with no urgency to it at all. He looked up when the gravel crunched under Jason's tires and didn't stand right away, just watched his son get out of the car, the same unhurried attention he'd have given a stranger walking up or a bird landing on the rail. "Dad!" Daniel set the net down. "Jason!" Jason had braced for anger. He'd braced honestly for the door not opening at all. What he got instead was his father rising slowly from the porch chair, walking to the door, and saying in a voice with no edge in it whatsoever, "Coffee's still hot. Come in if you want." They sat at a small kitchen table that could have seated two comfortably, and did that afternoon uncomfortably. Daniel poured two mugs. Didn't ask why Jason had come. Didn't need to. Jason turned his mug slowly on the table, watching the steam. "I lost the house," he said finally. Not lost it exactly. We're renting somewhere smaller now. Melanie took a job. I sold the boat before the dealership could repossess it at a loss. I had to explain to Ellie why we couldn't do the DC trip." His voice caught briefly on his daughter's name. "I keep thinking about that word in your letter. Permission." Daniel didn't say anything. He'd learned decades earlier that silence often finished sentences better than he ever could. "I've been going over it for weeks," Jason said. "All of it. The tuition, the wedding, the bridge loans I never once called loans, the pergola." He laughed short and joyless. "I told friends at the club you finally understood who was in charge. God. I actually said that out loud more than once, like it was something to be proud of." He looked up at his father, and for the first time since he'd walked in, his eyes were wet. I didn't come here because I lost the money, Dad. I mean, I did lose it, and it's bad. It's genuinely bad. We're going to be rebuilding for years. But that's not..." He stopped, started again quieter. "I came because I realized I lost you a long time before you actually left. I just never noticed because you never once made me notice. You just kept showing up to dinner and fixing things, and I kept letting you." Daniel studied his son's face for a long moment. He didn't reach across the table. He didn't say it's all right because it wasn't not yet, and he'd never once in his life told a lie for the sake of comfort. "I'm not going to pretend the money doesn't matter," he said finally. "It does. It always did. But that's not what I took away from you, Jason." Jason waited. "I took away the idea that someone else owes you your future." Daniel's voice stayed even the way it always did. "You're 39 years old. You've spent most of that time believing my generosity was a kind of debt I owed you, instead of a gift I chose to give. That's not entirely your fault. I let it grow that way for a long time before I noticed I was watering it." Jason wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, an old habit from childhood he hadn't done in years. "I don't forgive you overnight for a dinner table," Daniel said, "any more than I expect you to fix 39 years in one afternoon at a lake. But you drove 4 hours to sit in a kitchen with an old man in a fishing net. That's not nothing. That's a start." Jason nodded, throat too tight to answer. They didn't hug, didn't cry together exactly, though something in both of them had cracked and would take a long while yet to properly heal. Daniel simply refilled both mugs, and they sat another hour mostly quiet. The lake going gold and then gray outside the window, and for the first time in longer than either could remember, neither one of them needed the silence to mean anything more than two people finally sitting together in the same room. A year passed the way real healing usually does, slower than anyone would choose, and mostly without an audience. Jason took a job at a mid-sized marketing firm in Columbus, an entry-level account manager position he'd have considered beneath him 18 months earlier, back when he still believed his last name came with a salary attached. He learned to budget on a legal pad, the same kind of ledger his father had always kept, though it took him most of the winter to admit that was where he'd picked up the habit. He and Melanie moved into a modest two-bedroom rental smaller than the Colonial by half. No pergola, no landscape lighting, and found to their quiet surprise that they argued less there than they ever had in the bigger house. Ellie got her DC trip that spring paid for with money Jason had actually earned, and actually budgeted for a fact he mentioned to her twice, unprompted in a way that made her roll her eyes and hug him anyway. Every Sunday without fail, Jason made the drive up to the lake. Not for money. He'd stopped somewhere around February, even thinking to ask, and Daniel had noticed the change, the way he noticed most things quietly without comment, filing it away as evidence of something real. Jason came now because his father made good coffee and asked good questions, and never once in 50-some Sundays brought up the letter the bank or the year that had led to either. They fixed things together some Sundays, a loose porch board, a chain on the canoe, the same unhurried repairs Daniel had always used as a kind of language. Other Sundays they fished mostly in silence, the lake doing most of the talking. Jason found somewhere in that first winter that he'd started looking forward to the drive itself 4 hours each way. Radio off, nothing to do but sit with his own thoughts, which had gotten easier gradually to sit with. One Sunday in late September, almost exactly a year after Daniel had walked out of a bank in Ohio, with 6 cards fanned across a desk behind him, Daniel set 2 mugs down at the kitchen table and instead of the fishing net or the porch tools brought out the leather notebook. He set it in front of Jason without ceremony. "Your mother gave me this," Daniel said, "the year I opened my first office. I've kept it my whole career. I want you to have it now." Jason turned it over in his hands, the soft, worn cover, the rubber band standing in for a broken clasp, decades of his father's handwriting inside, some of it faded to sepia. He opened it carefully, the way you'd open something that had earned the right to be handled slowly. Most of the pages he only skimmed notes to himself, client philosophies, small observations Daniel had jotted down across a working lifetime. "Never confuse access with ownership," one page said, and Jason sat with that one, a long moment understanding it now in a way he never could have a year earlier. The final page was different. Different handwriting, smaller, looser, unmistakably a woman's hand. "The greatest inheritance isn't wealth. It's becoming someone worthy of receiving it." Jason read it twice, then closed the notebook gently, both hands resting on the cover, and didn't say anything for a while. Neither did Daniel. They carried their coffee out to the dock instead, the 2 new boards long since weathered to match the rest, the lake catching the last of the afternoon light and holding it gold, going to copper, going to gray. A pair of geese crossed low over the water, heading south, the first sign of the season turning. Jason sat down on the edge of the dock, feet nearly touching the water. His father sat beside him in no hurry, the way he'd never once in Jason's whole life been in a hurry to fill a silence that didn't need filling. "I used to think you were just getting by," Jason said, finally watching the water. "The truck, the house. I told people that for years, that you couldn't manage without me looking after things." Daniel didn't answer right away. When he did, there was no bitterness in it at all, just the same plain honesty he'd always carried. "I let people believe that," he said. "Your mother used to say wealth that stays quiet keeps its friends honest. I think somewhere along the way, I let it keep my own son a little too comfortable instead." Jason looked over at him. "Are you sorry for any of it, the accounts, the letter disappearing like that?" Daniel considered the question with the same care he gave everything, watching the geese disappear over the tree line. "No," he said. "I'm not sorry I did it. I'm sorry it took so long to become necessary." Jason nodded slowly and found for once that he didn't need to argue with it. The sun kept dropping toward the far tree line, the water going the color of the sky, the way it did twice a day at that lake, dawn and dusk, same as it always had. Neither man said anything else for a long while. They didn't need to. For the first time in longer than either of them could easily name, they were simply father and son again, sitting quietly together as the light went down, not because the money had come back, and not because anything had been fully repaired yet, but because both of them had finally stopped mistaking silence for distance and started letting it mean simply peace. Sometimes the deepest betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people we loved enough to trust with everything, our money, our time, our silence at a dinner table, when we should have spoken up instead. Daniel Carter never wanted revenge. He wanted more than anything for his son to understand that love and sacrifice are gifts, not debts that generosity given freely for 39 years doesn't quietly become an inheritance just because no one ever said otherwise out loud. He didn't win by shouting. He didn't win by punishing. He won the only way a man like Daniel ever really wins, by staying calm, staying clear, and letting the truth catch up to everyone else in its own time. If you've ever been taken for granted by someone you loved, if you've ever had to draw a hard, quiet boundary with your own family just to be seen as a person instead of a resource, you're not alone and you're not wrong for needing that boundary. I genuinely like to hear your story. Have you ever had to protect yourself from someone who confused your love for an obligation? Share it in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Someone standing at their own kitchen table wondering if they're allowed to finally say no. And if stories about quiet strength, dignity, and the kind of justice that never needs to raise its voice mean something to you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for the next one. There are many more journeys ahead, and sometimes one quiet story is enough to change the way we see our own.